Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to tackle a question that's been debated for centuries, and one that honestly kind of freaks me out a little.
Oh, yeah.
It's about whether Jesus went to hell after he died.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a big one for sure, and not exactly a light topic, huh?
Definitely not. And I'm not even sure where to start with this one.
Well, luckily, I think a good place to begin is with the source of this whole debate, you know?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
It all stems from a specific passage in the Bible, one that's sparked a ton of different interpretations over the years.
I think I know which one you're talking about. 1 Peter 3.1820.
Yeah.
Right? That one always kind of threw me for a loop.
Exactly. Even just reading it on the surface, it raises so many questions like, who are these spirits in prison that it talks about?
Yeah, what kind of prison are we even talking about here?
Right. And how does this all fit with the whole story of Jesus dying and then coming back to life?
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, so many layers to unpack there.
Well, luckily, you sent over some awesome material from our Daily Bread that delves into all of this.
Oh, yeah. Did you get a chance to look it over?
I did. It's got the actual biblical text, some historical context, and a bunch of different theological viewpoints to unpack. Should be a fascinating deep dive. You ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so the source material starts right off the bat with that 1 Peter passage, 1 Peter 3.1820. Do you want to do the honors and read that for us?
Sure thing. All right, so it says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built."
Wow. Yeah, okay, so much to unpack there. I feel like just hearing it read aloud brings up even more questions than before.
Yeah, it's a lot.
The phrase that really jumps out at me is spirits in prison.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's the most ambiguous part of the whole thing. Really, it's what this whole debate hinges on.
Right.
And our Daily Bread, it lays out a bunch of possible interpretations, each with its own logic and reasoning.
Okay, let's put on our detective hats and see if we can make sense of this. First things first, who are these spirits and what's this prison all about?
One interpretation is that these spirits are fallen angels, specifically the ones who rebelled against God back in Noah's time.
Okay, fallen angels, so not human souls. Interesting.
You can find support for this idea by looking at other parts of the Bible. Genesis 6.1-4 talks about angels messing around with human women, which led to those giant offspring.
Nephilim, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's Jude 6, which mentions angels who basically abandon their posts and their proper dwelling. Could be referring to these same rebellious angels now imprisoned for their actions.
So in this interpretation, Jesus is going down to basically rub it in their faces, like a told yasso kind of thing.
It's not so much about gloating. It's more like a declaration of his power and authority, even over these rebellious spiritual beings.
Okay, so even in the spiritual realm, he's in charge. It's like emphasizing the huge scale of his victory.
Exactly.
Okay, that's one possibility. What other clues are there? What else could these spirits in prison represent?
Well, another interpretation is that these spirits are actually all the dead.
Ooh, okay, so everyone, both the good and the bad.
Exactly. In this view, Jesus descends into Hades or Sheol to announce his victory over sin and death to everyone who had died before him.
So it's not necessarily the fiery hell that we often think of, but more like a general holding place for souls.
Yeah, exactly. It aligns with how both ancient Jews and early Christians thought about Sheol and Hades.
Okay, I see. So this interpretation emphasizes the universal reach of Jesus' victory, right? It applies to everyone who died before him.
Right.
Interesting. It raises so many questions about the fate of those who lived before Jesus' time on earth.
It really does.
And what about God's plan for those who lived before his teachings were known?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got fallen angels, and we've got the entire population of the dead. Are there any other interpretations to consider?
There's one more. It might sound a little out there at first, but it suggests that this whole thing isn't about a literal descent into a physical prison at all.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Instead, it's more of a symbolic representation of Jesus working through Noah.
Ooh, interesting. So back in the Old Testament.
Remember how the verse mentions those who were disobedient in the days of Noah? Well, some scholars believe that Jesus, through his spirit, was already active even before he was born as a human, and that he preached repentance through Noah.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
So the prison here wouldn't be a physical place, but rather the state of disobedience and separation from God that humanity was in before the flood.
Right. Okay, that's a pretty mind-blowing interpretation. So we have three very different ways of understanding this one verse.
It really shows how complex biblical interpretation can be, huh?
It does. But before we go any further, you mentioned something earlier called the Apostles' Creed.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that it also kind of plays into this debate. Can you remind me what that is again?
The Apostles' Creed is a super old statement of faith from the early Christian church. It's got a line that says, "He descended into hell."
Right. And that obviously lends itself to a pretty literal interpretation of this whole thing.
It does, yeah.
But we were talking earlier about how hell back then might not mean what we typically think of today,
Yeah.
right? Not necessarily the fire and brimstone imagery.
Exactly. Remember, language evolves over time. In this case, hell probably refers to Hades or Sheol, that realm of the dead we were talking about.
Right. That's super important to remember. So the Apostles' Creed might not be talking about eternal damnation, but rather about the general place where the dead go.
Exactly. You got to take the historical context into account, you know?
Yeah, that totally changes how I understand that line in the creed.
Yeah.
But even with that distinction, it definitely makes things more complex, right? I mean, it's in this core statement of faith that's been recited for centuries.
It really adds another layer. It definitely gets you thinking.
It does. Okay, so we have that main passage in 1 Peter and the Apostles' Creed adding to the mystery. But I think I remember our daily bread piece, looking at other verses too, right? Like ones that either support or challenge these different interpretations.
Oh, it totally does. This is where it gets even more interesting because you start seeing how nuanced and, well, messy biblical interpretation can be.
Okay, yeah, let's dive into some of these other verses. What's the first one?
Well, there's Ephesians 4:8-10. It talks about Christ ascending and descending to the lower parts of the earth.
Okay, and what are the different interpretations of that one?
Some people see that as a pretty clear reference to Jesus going to the realm of the dead after he died, but other folks, they see it more metaphorically. They think it's referring to his incarnation, his coming down from heaven to earth, and then also his burial.
So even with that one verse, how you interpret it depends on how you see it within the bigger picture.
Exactly, and that's so important to keep in mind. Context is key when you're trying to understand the Bible.
Okay, noted. What about the next verse?
Well, next up is Psalm 16.10, and it's actually quoted in Acts 2.27. This one seems to suggest that Jesus didn't stay in the realm of the dead.
Okay, how so?
Well, it says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption." A lot of folks see this as a prophecy about Jesus coming back to life, being resurrected. It indicates that he didn't stay in that realm of the dead.
Which, of course, is central to Christian belief, right? The whole idea of the resurrection.
Yep.
But that does kind of complicate things, doesn't it? I mean, if he was raised from the dead, it makes you wonder how he could spend a long time in the realm of the dead. It's one of those verses that makes you go, how does that fit?
It does, yeah. A real head scratcher.
Okay, what other curveballs does the Bible throw at us on this topic?
Well, then there's Luke 23.43, the verse where Jesus is on the cross, and he tells the thief next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise."
Right. I remember that one. But doesn't that kind of contradict the whole idea of him going to hell?
It does seem to, right. If Jesus went straight to paradise, how could he have also gone to hell or Hades? It seems like those two ideas just don't line up.
Exactly. And that's where this whole debate gets really tough. How do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory verses? Do we have to pick one interpretation and just go with that? Or is there another way to approach this?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's something theologians have been trying to figure out for centuries.
So what does the Our Daily Bread piece have to say about this? How does it navigate this tricky territory?
Well, it definitely acknowledges that there's tension between these different verses, and that there's really no simple answer that's going to satisfy everyone.
Okay, so there's no easy solution.
Right, and the piece encourages us to really wrestle with these texts, consider different viewpoints, and try to come to our own understanding based on careful study and, also prayer.
So it's not about finding the one right answer, but more about the process of trying to understand.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so even with all these passages, we still have some unanswered questions. It's like we're putting together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
I think that's a great way to put it.
But I guess that's what makes this so fascinating, right? It's about exploring these complex topics, even if we don't come up with neat and tidy answers.
I think you're right. That's the beauty of theological inquiry, It makes you think, it challenges your assumptions, and sometimes, you're left with more questions than answers, but that's okay.
Agreed. Okay, so we've looked at 3 interpretations of that First Peter passage, considered how the Apostles' Creed factors in, and we even looked at some other Bible verses that both support and challenge these different views.
Quite a bit, yeah.
But now I'm curious, what do modern theologians think about all of this? Is there a general consensus, or are there still different schools of thought?
Even today, there's still a lot of debate. There's no one universally accepted answer. Some theologians, like John Piper, for example, they're very much against a literal descent into hell. They focus more on the idea that Jesus went straight to be with God after he died.
Interesting. So emphasizing the immediate presence of God after death. What about other perspectives?
Yeah, then you have scholars like N.T. Wright. He takes a different approach. He emphasizes the historical context, how hell back then was understood as Hades or Sheol, the realm of the dead.
Right, we were just talking about that. So for N.T. Wright, Jesus going to hell needs to be understood within how ancient Jews and early Christians thought about the afterlife.
Exactly. He's all about understanding the historical context. It's really interesting stuff.
So Piper is focused on the immediate presence of God after death, while Wright is focused on the historical understanding of the afterlife. 2 very different lenses through which to view this whole issue.
It is, yeah. It shows how even within Christianity, there can be a lot of diversity in thought and interpretation.
Which is great. It's good to be reminded that there's not always one right answer to every question.
It's about being open to different perspectives.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored that key Bible passage, considered different interpretations, even touched on the ongoing debate among modern-day theologians.
Feels like we're just getting started.
Right. But unfortunately, we've got to pause here for now. When we come back, we'll delve into the theological implications of all of this and try to figure out what it all means for our own understanding of life and death. Stay tuned.
All right, so picking up where we left off, we spent a lot of time untangling the different interpretations of 1 Peter 3.1, 8, 20.
Yeah, that was a lot. All those different perspectives on whether Jesus went to hell.
Right. But even if we don't have a clear-cut answer about whether it literally happened or not, there's still a lot we can learn from this whole discussion.
Yeah, totally. Like, what insights can we take away from this? Something to apply to our own faith journey, even if we don't know for sure if Jesus actually went to hell.
Well, one thing that really struck me is that no matter which interpretation you find most convincing, it points to how massive Jesus's victory really was.
Yeah.
It suggests that his triumph extends beyond his earthly life and even into the realm of death itself.
Okay, so whether he's proclaiming victory to those fallen angels or talking to everyone who's died or working through Noah, it's all about a cosmic victory over sin and death.
Exactly. And that has some serious implications for how we think about the afterlife. It goes straight to the core of Christian hope and that promise of resurrection.
You're right. It makes you think about what happens to us when we die, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What happens to those who live before Christ? And what does it mean for believers today? Yeah, big questions, huh?
Huge. But this whole discussion does offer some clues, I think.
Oh, definitely. Our Daily Bread really highlights how this discussion underscores that hope of resurrection. If Jesus descended into the realm of the dead and then rose again, it means death isn't the end for believers.
So it's like this powerful image of hope, even though death is something we're all afraid of.
Right. Ultimate victory over our biggest fear.
Yeah, like a beacon of light in the darkness.
Exactly. And it speaks to how powerful Jesus' resurrection really was. It's not just about him, It's a cosmic victory that changes everything about how we understand life and death.
This is intense stuff. It makes you think about the bigger picture, What's waiting for us after this life? It's kind of scary, but also amazing at the same time.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does. Okay, so we've talked about Jesus' victory over death and that hope of resurrection. What else does this passage tell us? Does our daily bread connect this to other core Christian beliefs? It does, yeah. It brings up the themes of God's justice and mercy, reminding us that he's patient and just, even for people who lived before Jesus came to earth.
So even those who didn't get to hear the gospel during their lifetime are still within God's reach.
It seems that way, yeah. Which is a pretty comforting thought.
Definitely.
I mean, it's a question that's been debated for a long time, but this passage suggests that God's plan of salvation is bigger than we can imagine. It goes beyond time and space, you know? It's a reminder that we don't fully understand how God works.
Yeah, it's a beautiful reminder that God's ways are not our ways, and that his understanding of justice and mercy is so much greater than ours.
Exactly. And it calls us to trust in his wisdom and his love.
I have to admit, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all the different interpretations of that passage from 1 Peter. It's a lot to process.
Oh, I hear ya. It's a tough one for sure.
So what are we supposed to take away from all this? If there's no one right answer, how do we even approach such a complex theological question?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the question of whether Jesus descended into hell is more than just an academic debate, you know? It makes us think about the nature of Jesus's victory, the extent of his salvation, and the mysteries of life and death. It's not about finding a definitive answer, but about growing in our understanding of these core parts of our faith.
It's like faith is a journey, not a destination, right? We're always learning and growing and grappling with these big questions.
Exactly. It's about the process of seeking truth, not necessarily having all the answers.
I like that perspective. It reminds me that it's okay to have doubts, you know? It can actually be an opportunity for deeper exploration and understanding.
Absolutely. Embrace the tension and let it strengthen your faith.
Before we move on, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the debate among modern theologians. You mentioned John Piper and N.T. Wright, and I was hoping you could elaborate a little on their different viewpoints.
Oh, yeah, sure. So John Piper, he's got a more conservative perspective. He argues that Jesus didn't go to hell, but instead went straight to be with God after he died. He bases this on his interpretation of specific Bible verses, especially those that emphasize the unity of Christ's person and the completeness of his sacrifice on the cross.
So for Piper, it's all about that immediate reconciliation with God through Christ's death. What about N.T. Wright?
Right, so N.T. Wright has a more nuanced take on it, rooted in his understanding of the historical context of the New Testament. He says, hell in this context should be understood as Hades or Sheol, the realm of the dead, and that Jesus going there needs to be seen through the lens of ancient Jewish and early Christian beliefs about the afterlife. He emphasizes how, for early Christians, the resurrection wasn't just about individual salvation. It was about the start of God's kingdom and the ultimate defeat of death itself.
So Piper is focusing on the immediate presence of God, and Wright is focusing on the historical context of the afterlife and the bigger meaning of the resurrection. Two very different approaches, but both valid.
Exactly. And it shows how there's not one single answer to this question, right? You have to interpret the Bible, consider different theological views, and come to your own understanding through study and prayer.
It's amazing how different scholars, even within the same faith, can look at the same text and come to different conclusions.
It's really cool, right? It just goes to show how rich and complex Scripture is and how theological interpretation is always evolving.
Well, I'm glad we explored those different viewpoints. It's helped me see that this whole issue is much more nuanced than I originally thought. It's not a simple yes or no answer. It's something that deserves a lot of reflection and engagement with the Bible.
And that's what we do here on The Deep Dive, right? Explore those complex topics and come away with a better understanding of our world and ourselves.
That's right. But as much as I'd love to keep going, we've got to pause here for now. When we come back, we'll wrap up this whole discussion and leave you with a thought-provoking question to ponder. See you soon. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this question of whether Jesus went to hell after his death.
It's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
It has. We've been through biblical passages, historical perspectives. We even touched on those modern theological debates.
Lots to unpack.
For sure. And, you know, even without a definitive answer, I feel like we've gained a lot of insight into this whole idea of Jesus's victory over death and what that means for us.
I think so too, yeah. It's been a real eye-opener for me as well.
Yeah. So as we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts. What's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
That's a good question. Let me see. If I could leave you with just one thought to ponder, it would be this. If Jesus did go to the realm of the dead, what does that tell us about just how powerful his victory over death really was? And what might it mean for how we understand life after death?
Whoa, that's a lot to think about. It takes this whole discussion and makes it personal. You know, it's not just some abstract theological debate anymore. It's something that touches on our deepest hopes and fears.
Exactly. It's about grappling with the mysteries of our faith and thinking about God's love and power in a whole new way. You know, it pushes us beyond those simple answers and makes us confront the really big questions at the heart of Christianity.
I love that. And even if we don't come up with a clear-cut answer, Just wrestling with these questions can be a powerful experience.
It really can.
It deepens our faith, helps us understand more, and I think it brings us closer to God.
I agree. It's in those moments when we're grappling with doubts and uncertainty, that's when we often experience the most growth.
So to everyone listening out there, don't stop exploring this topic. Read the Bible, look at different perspectives, and let yourself be challenged. Don't be afraid of those tough questions, and it's okay to be uncomfortable not having all the answers.
Remember, faith is a journey. It's about embracing the mystery, seeking understanding, and letting the truth change you. Think of this deep dive as a starting point for your own exploration of this complex and really important issue.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. I hope you found it as thought-provoking as I did. Until next time, keep searching, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep.